Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nugentino Cinema. I'm here again today with Kay. How are you?
I'm a little under the weather, but I'm okay overall. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. Sorry to hear you're under the weather, but yeah, has it been an easy run for you in terms of being sick?
I mean, I've definitely felt worse, but I've also felt better. Yesterday was a lot worse, but I feel like I'm recovered enough today. So when you asked if I wanted to review this movie, I was like, sick schmick, let's do it. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'm glad you reached out and asked if I'd review this. It's definitely like helped given me stamina today and something to look forward to other than just being on the sofa. So
yeah.
yeah,
Well, thanks. Thanks for
yeah,
doing it.
yeah.
Like, yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Um, so we're reviewing The Love Witch today, and I know this is it was one of your favorite movies, or like a movie you really liked. So do you want to just give like a little preface for your background with the movie?
Yeah, definitely. So this is, like you said, one of my favorite movies. In fact, I think it was like 2020, something like that. Just a few years ago, I had it in my top four on Letterboxd. I think I even had it in the number one spot because it just really clicked with me.
Mhm.
I've seen this movie a number of times. Today, rewatching it for this chat was my sixth. I don't know why that's so hard for me to say. Sixth time watching it. Um, and yeah, so the first time I ever saw this was when it was first released in theaters in 2016, which feels like yesterday and a long time ago at the same time, which is really weird. Let's not talk about it. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I first saw it in 2016, and I've seen it, yeah, just a few times since then. It's always such a treat. And it was funny for me this time because I had this little feeling. I was like, I bet I could quote some of this. And so just to myself, I was like quoting a few lines here and there. Definitely nothing like being able to recite the whole movie, but I have some favorite lines, and yeah, some bits in this just really hit for me. So it's always a fun one to revisit. I don't really have any kind of special story about how I found it or anything. I definitely have had some cool experiences like with the movie I can kind of get into. Um, like oh, I don't know. I feel like I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. This was your first time watching this movie, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's my first time watching it, but I do
Okay.
remember I saw it. Well, I didn't see it, but I remember seeing the trailer of the Alamo Draft House around when it would have came out, like in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And I never ended up seeing it back then, but I remember being even back then struck by the cinematography and the way they captured like a 60s aesthetic. And I remember wanting to see it back then, but I never, for some reason, saw it. But yeah, so recently, or just today, I saw it for the first time, and I saw it on Mubi, which is actually a really good streaming service. I like just got a free trial of Mubi, and I've watched like three movies on there already. Um, and yeah, I enjoyed the movie. Yeah, so it's directed by Anna Biller, and
Yeah.
I know she directed a bunch of other shorts. I've looked at her filmography, and she just from the images I've seen, they look very similar in the aesthetic. And
Mm-hmm.
I looked at your letterbox. I saw that you saw or you watched some of her other shorts as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just earlier today, to prepare for this chat, I wanted to, because it had been a little while since I'd seen or watched The Love Witch. I think it'd been like maybe a year or so. And so I was like, I kind of wanted to get back into the energy of like what she does and her aesthetic and kind of just dip my toes back in. So I watched A Visit from the Incubus, which is a really fun little 30-minute short she did. And it's kind of like Western style. So it very much has this like Technicolor feel, but it's kind of Western and it still has this horror film feel to it. So you can see like her heavy influences and like what's important to her and like conveying through her art. And what's interesting too is that she is so hands on with all of the films that she makes. She wears so many hats. So she like writes, directs, makes costumes, builds sets for a lot of the stuff. So like for a Visit from the Incubus, she had like designed all of the sets, costumes, did some of the music, wrote the whole thing, directed it, and edited it. So she made pretty much the whole movie like by herself. And a lot of that carried over to Love Witch as well. So a lot of Love Witch, she is like she was kind of the force behind it. And so you can see like a lot of her voice come through in all of the different elements. And I think it gives it this really unique feel and like richness. And you can tell, like, you could look at a still and be like, that's an Anna Biller film. And I really appreciate that about her. And like her being so true to her voice and perspective. And I think that comes through like in her storytelling and everything too, because her films seem to have like similar themes, and she approaches them through this kind of like lens of like horror, and but also this kind of like fantasy, like overly theatrical, satirical perspective as well. So she has this really cool like witch's brew of elements that go into her things. So I admire her a lot, like as a creative person, and I think that everybody would agree that The Love Witch is like her masterpiece.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've always hoped that she would do more, but considering this came out in 2016 and I haven't heard a peep since, I'm not letting my hopes get too high.
Yeah, yeah. I was surprised she hasn't made anything since this. Has she
Yeah.
made any other feature films
Yeah,
before?
so there is one other she did that's actually longer than Love Witch. It's about 2 hours. It's called Viva. I haven't seen it yet, but it deals with a lot of similar things from what I understand. It's like a 1970s housewife gets kind of thrown into the hippie sex orgy scene and kind of goes through this whole tumultuous, got it, tumultuous like realization of like how the world really is, and like this whole other world outside of what she had experienced in her life as like kind of a sheltered housewife. So yeah, so I mean I was actually thinking about maybe watching that one tomorrow now that I'm back on the Anna Biller beat. But yeah, that's the only other feature that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I'd like to watch that. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's surprising she hasn't made more stuff. I liked
no.
I forget the name of the main actress, but I thought she was good in it. And I was surprised to see, I looked at her filmography and she was actually in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Oh really? What role do you
Mhm.
know?
It was a small part, but she was Abigail Folger, who was one of Sharon Tate's friends. And you see her at the end, like when she's hanging out at the house, and it's building up to like what would have been the Manson murders, but spoiler alert, it goes in a different direction in the movie. But
Yeah.
mhm, yeah,
Crazy. Oh, I do just want to say really quickly too, I'm also a huge Mubi fan. I've been using their streaming service for a number of years, and I have like the Mubi Notebook subscription. I love it. I hope you stick with it. They're wonderful at curating for their website and everything. Um, Obviously, since they have the Love Witch, we can trust their curation. Um, yeah, a couple other little things just about this movie from like a personal standpoint for me. I was actually fortunate enough to visit California a few years ago, and I rented a car in LA and I drove up the coast to San Francisco and then up to Eureka. And this film takes place in Eureka in California, so you kind of see like little glimpses of like California on the license plates and stuff. But if you're not familiar with like the geography of the place, you might not know it. So like they do show the coast when she's driving up, and so most people might recognize it as being like that part of California. But
mhm,
in case you didn't, it takes place in Eureka, and it's this really beautiful small town that's kind of nestled against the redwoods, about an hour and a half north of San Francisco. And so I was driving up there from San Francisco, and there's this specific scenic drive. It's like the Redwood something trail. It's not trail. I'm spacing on it, but
mhm,
locals would know it, and everybody else has access to Google, I'm sure. But there's this road that you drive up through the woods, and it's actually how she starts the film, is like her driving up the coast and through the redwoods. And it's just really beautiful. And so it was cool for me to do that same drive and basically like trace those steps of the start of the movie. And then that house, the big purple, like Gothic style house, is actually in Eureka. So I got to go see it. It's privately owned, so I didn't get to go inside, but I got to see the outside, and it looks just like that, which is so wild. It's like totally normal and suburban, and then there's like this huge, like crazy Gothic house. It's so awesome. And the Herbs and Arts store, or the Moonrise Herbs, which will come in later in the film, is also a real place, and I got to go in there and buy some stuff, and that was really neat. And I asked the clerk if they were familiar with the Love Witch and knew anything about it, and she was like, "Oh, I've heard of that." So it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's neat. I got to have like my own little tourist moment. And I think actually in the beginning of the film, as she's driving into the town, you see like the Eureka theater. And that's actually like an old movie theater. And they've
I
been
noticed that in the movie. Yeah.
yeah. So they were in the process of, or they were when I was visiting, in the process of restoring it. And I got to go in and see it like all gutted and like the old projection booths and stuff. It's really neat. So I guess I just say that like because I feel like I have like a very deep attachment with this movie because I've like kind of been to these places and like I don't know, it just gives a different sense to it. So I feel like very close with this film in like a tangible way as well as like emotional way. um, but yeah, I was thinking that maybe I should bring that up later, but I was like, when would be a good time to work that in? So I thought I'd just mention it now because it's just really special for me. But yeah, she's just a great director, and I wonder, yeah, I do hope that she does more because she has such a strong voice in what she makes, and I would love to see what else she does. Even if it's just more of the same, she'll be like Wes Anderson of this like 90s or not 90s, of this like 70s pastiche. Oh my God, pastiche aesthetic. I got it together, Drew. I've got this. I've got this. My
Yeah.
brain functioning at full capacity. But anyway, what did you think of the film? First time watch. How did it hit you?
I really liked it. Well, one I wanted to bring up, I did want to bring up the fact that you visited some of those locations because I saw it in
Oh
one of your
yeah.
reviews.
Yeah.
But it actually reminds me of, funnily enough, I visited some like his Rushmore, the Wes Anderson movie was shot in Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And I've visited some of those locations, and it's always like really cool when you have like, a connection to a movie like that, like when you've been to
Yeah.
some of the places. And yeah, that's really cool. And funnily, and I've been to the Death Proof bar in Austin, and yeah, it's always really cool when you get to see stuff like that for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about our conversation about Brewster McCloud and how you have like that connection to Houston and it makes it more special. And it's like, obviously, I'm not from Eureka or California, but it still kind of gives that connection. So yeah, it's really special. And it's just like a little bit of fun for us film nerds to be like, oh, I've been there, I've seen that.
Yeah,
It's just,
definitely.
it's really cool. It makes it feel so much more real. So like watching it again today, I just, I could just like feel like I was just like, forming the rest of the environment around the scene, and it just gives it this like richness.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, so you liked it, yeah?
Yeah, and one other
I'm
thing
so
I wanted to
glad.
say is like I think because I mentioned that the main actress was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and a
Mm-hmm.
small part, but like I feel like Quentin Tarantino had to have seen this because
Hmm.
it's so like it's doing not exactly what he would do, but like similarly, like really capturing the vibe and the aesthetic of a '60s film. He does that a little bit in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood for sure, and also I would say I don't know if you've heard of this director, but um, the director it reminded me the most of was Herschel Gordon Lewis. Like I got like a huge Herschel Gordon Lewis vibe throughout the whole movie.
What have they made?
He made like blood sucking. He made like horror movies like in the '60s. It was like
Hmm.
blood sucking freaks, and then like a movie called Blood Feast. But there's something about the cinematography in his movies and the colors. He was actually one of the earliest like directors to really incorporate like gore and stuff into his movies. This is like in the mid '60s.
I think
Um,
I've seen Blood Feast, but I forget. There's a
mhm.
lot of horror movies with the name blood in them, so it's kind of hard to keep them
Yeah,
straight sometimes.
he's got several of them.
Yeah.
He's got the Wizard of Gore, which was referenced in like Juno. It's the first time I heard about him in Juno.
Nice. I remember that actually. I used to love that movie. I was the target audience, so you know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that because when I was watching this, I was thinking, well, you mentioned, you know, Quentin Tarantino and that train and everything, but I feel like are you familiar with Jacques Demy, the French
I
director?
I've heard of him, but I haven't seen any of his movies. But I'm aware of what his style is.
Yeah, he did like Umbrellas of Cherbourg and like all of that. So he did this film called Donkey Skin or Podon in 1970 that I know for a fact Anna Biller has talked about and like pulled influence from. And I was actually just watching like little clips of it before we hopped on for this conversation. And I was like, oh my gosh, like absolutely. And I mean, I've seen that film before and made the relation, but like just watching those bits right after having watched Love Witch, it's so clear because it's kind of this like fantasy, over the top, theatrical fairy tale thing. And then that one is strongly feminist as well. Like Donkey Skin is about a princess who's um, a king's wife dies, and the wife is like, don't marry anybody unless you love them as much as me. And he's like, that's impossible unless I marry my daughter. And so the whole film is about him trying to marry his daughter, and her being like, oh my God, I don't want to marry my dad. So that's a great film as well. And she pulled a lot from that aesthetically and maybe not thematically, but in terms of like how to convey the story in this way. So yeah, I would recommend checking out some of his stuff. He was also married to Agnes Varda for a number of years, so that gives him extra cred. I love her so much. But yeah, I'll check out some Herschel Gordon Lewis. Is that right?
Yeah.
Nailed it. And in return, you can check out a Jacques Demy film. I think you'd like it a lot.
Yeah, Donkey Skin sounds really interesting, and then
Yeah.
I'd also like to see the Umbrellas of Cherbourg. Well, I know it's like his main most famous movie.
Yeah, definitely maybe start with the classic before going to Donkey Skin, but it's still totally worth checking out. And I think it's even on Criterion, so easy to access. But yeah, enjoy more stuff from movie first. We're gonna turn this into a little movie ad. Let's get you a movie sponsorship.
Yeah, well, I made like a watch list of like 60 movies on there, so I really like their selection.
Yeah, they have great stuff. Um, yeah, so I mean, there's lots of stuff that she pulled from for this movie, of course. Like it is very much a pastiche. But I think that she imbues so much of her own voice and intention into these elements that it definitely like transcends just the aesthetic. I know that like a lot of what her work is praised for and highlighted for is that aesthetic, like her strong use of color. It's so vivid. It's such an homage to Technicolor and that kind of like Hollywood fantasy, like the Hollywood romance kind of a different era. Obviously not like the golden age, but it's kind of just like still in this romantic era of Hollywood, I think. And so I feel like she creates such a like rich environment within her stories, and then she does it in such a witty, satirical, theatrical way. Like you can totally feel that it's her, even though she's drawing from all of these different things. And I think that is so praiseworthy in itself because it's like, you know, it's been done so many times before where people pull from these elements and just kind of like just let them be what they are, but to actually take those and manipulate them into something new, I think is a unique skill in itself. And so I think that she's just so creative and so astute in the way that she chooses to frame things and the way that, excuse me, I am still sick. I'm sorry.
No problem.
The way that I lost my train of thought. But just, yeah, the way that she tells her story using these elements, I think transcends the elements themselves. Like it's still very much embedded in this thing. And she uses that to tell the story because it's like by setting it in this certain place and time, you know, kind of, it conveys the feeling of the time. I'm getting lost in my own thoughts. I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought there when I coughed, and I forgot where I was going with that. But I just think that, I think that the aesthetic is sometimes the ultimate draw or reason to avoid her filmmaking. Some people might not like be interested in that perspective, and some people might be drawn to it specifically for that. But I just mean, I think that there's something like beyond just the aesthetic that's worth exploring in her films. And I think she has a lot to say, and I think she says it really well, and in a way that's like totally unique and what's the word I'm trying to say? I can't think of it. Accessible. It's accessible. She makes it so accessible through humor. And this movie makes me laugh so much. It makes me laugh even more every time I watch it. I think because I know some of the bits are coming, and it kind of like I get excited for it and just cracks me up. But yeah, I mentioned before there are some lines in particular that just really make me laugh.
What are the funniest parts for you?
Oh man, it's kind of hard to talk about without getting into like spoilers. We would almost need to like kind of discuss the the story itself because it's just like little bits. Um, like I don't want to get too far ahead, but like the first one that comes to mind is when she's sitting in the car with Wayne and she gives him the flask and he's like, "Oh, what's in this?" And she's just like, "Finish it." And just like deadpan, like that
Yeah.
kind of stuff just makes me laugh so hard because it's just so funny. I don't know. It's like her delivery of it is so great because it's so just direct and so deadpan and yeah, it just really tickles me.
Yeah.
But yeah, nobody who's never seen this before would even know who Wayne is. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what actually happens in the movie and what it's about. Um, so yeah, this film is about a woman named Elaine in, gosh, wow, I don't know why I'm like my brain is fried all of a sudden. I'm so sorry, Drew. So it's about this young woman named Elaine, and she is basically escaping to Northern California to reinvent her life in where nobody knows her except for a few people. And kind of like there's this sort of like inherent romance and like going somewhere new and being someone new and so she kind of is in the process of reinventing her life as a witch and she's already established as a witch by the time she is embarking on this journey to Northern California, but she's still kind of coming into herself and like exploring how to use magic. And as far as we can see through the course of the film, she's sometimes a little bit more powerful than she realizes. But just to quickly pin that, like I love the way that they handle magic in this film because it rides the line so perfectly of it being completely grounded in reality and being like a little bit fantasy, where it's not like magic spells and sparkles and stuff necessarily. Like it's all like herbal based. It's very like tangible, and it feels very
It's kind of the
realistic in
stuff that
that
you would
sense.
see in like actual shops, like, weird herbal shops, or I feel like I've been to places like that.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. There's a place like that not too far from me. And it just kind of so like a lot of the magic that she does and a lot of the potions that she has are like vodka and wild berries and like hallucinogenic herbs. And so you get the sense that like the magic she's participating in is actually just kind of like using these natural elements to create these situations like she makes somebody basically trip on shrooms in order to fall in love with her and like in reality you're like yeah if you're tripping and you have an experience like that it's definitely going to impact you and so it's like it kind of rides this line but then there are also times where you're like I don't know like maybe it could be a little bit fantasy maybe there is a little bit of this magical element to it like maybe it is just like a side step outside of reality and so I really like the way that it builds magic in a way that feels realistic without it being like too real. You know, like you could probably go and research these things and find like adjacent truths in the magical community. Magical community meaning people who practice like witchcraft and stuff.
yeah.
But then you could also, you can also just let it be a suspension of belief and kind of um, suspension of disbelief. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna go ahead and blame this on my sick brain. I'm trying really hard, I promise. But yeah, so I really like that element of it, and I feel like that speaks to like her approach and how there's always this kind of fantasy or theatrical element to her work, but it's always speaking about something real. And so in that way, it kind of rides this line of like being very real and being a little bit outside of reality at the same time, which makes it a little bit more palatable and approachable. So I like that about her film, her films. And I feel like I'm speaking a lot right now, but to get back to what the film is actually about, so she goes and kind of is reestablishing herself in this new town, this small town, as a witch, and her intention is to use love magic to find the perfect man who will perfectly love her. And in return, she will give them perfect love because apparently there is such a thing as perfect love. um, and so, yeah, it's a really interesting approach to dealing with not only like feminine romanticism and the female gaze, but kind of how that's used to deal with patriarchy, but is also influenced by patriarchy. So it's like you desire these things, and the only way that you know to achieve them is by playing within these bounds, but those bounds are patriarchy. And so how do you kind of deal with that? So I think she approaches that really well. And at the same time, I do feel like before we get too much into like the nitty gritty of it, it should be acknowledged that like as much as I love this film and as much as I love Anna Biller's work and I think she's great, it's not a perfect film. There are definitely issues with it that I think are very reasonable and worth acknowledging. Like for one, this movie is very white. I think there's like only one person in it who's like not white in the entire movie, and she maybe only gets like 2 short scenes. I'm thinking of the black officer in the police department who's like, "I'll get you coffee," and so there's like that part of it that's a
Well, it
little
was the
bit
guy, the other guy punches too, his like partner.
right. Yeah, but still, like the ratio is very like it's a very kind of white
Yeah,
movie.
for sure.
And then it's also very heteronormative, which I think is part of the commentary, but is still something that's worth acknowledging. The fact that like it's not it's very within the standard binary. It's, heterosexual woman, heterosexual man, everybody around them is also within these gender norms. And so I think that's worth acknowledging as well, that this is very much within this kind of and it's difficult because she's pulling from an era and aesthetic where these things were true. I mean, like if you look back at these movies, like aside from blaxploitation and things, most mainstream Hollywood movies were very whitewashed, and it's still a problem that Hollywood is dealing with. And then also just being very heteronormative and not really having any representation outside of that. But again, it's kind of difficult because it's the story about this woman who's looking for love from a man, and so it's like it's just worth acknowledging, I think, that it's not a perfect movie and that it has a lot of room to grow, and that I hope that when when Anna Biller goes on to make her next film, we'll have like a little bit more inclusive cast and a more diverse representation of people of all kinds. So I think that's worth noting. But for taking the film for what it's giving us and what we are able to discuss for what it's done, I think it's very, very good, and I think she accomplished what she set out to do, and that's notable. But yeah, I feel like I've kind of thrown out a lot about this, and so just kind of like going, I don't know. Do you have any? I feel like I threw so much information at you. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Do you have any thoughts kind of on the film in particular? Are there things that stood out to you, things that you liked or didn't like? Let's
Well, I
talk
want to go
about
back to like you were talking about the magic, how it had kind of a realistic feel, and I was thinking that I agree, and I feel like It was just like, not to say that it's actually realistic, because it still feels magical, but like just the way she talks about it. There was one part where she says like, magic is only really like harnessing energy, or like
Mm,
directing your energy at something.
yeah.
And I thought that was interesting, and definitely the way they do it, like, with, like you said, it's like herbs and stuff, and it's stuff that could happen, or like the way you would think somebody might approach it in the real world. So I thought that was cool, for sure.
I'm curious too about your perspective on this, like as a man, because it's a very feminine film. I mean, we get the pink harp playing tea room, we get all of these like decadent fashions. It's very feminine. And so I just kind of wonder like, um, if that worked for you, if it was something that you kind of had to like adapt to as you were watching it. What was your experience like watching the movie?
I really liked it. I feel like the only thing, not that this is like a bad thing, but the only thing that felt like almost like comically like feminine to me was like the tea room.
Yeah,
Yeah, and some of
and
the
like that,
music that was playing. But
I know it's so funny. The like tra la 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 di da.
yeah.
It's so funny. That's actually another part that had me cracking up. And it's like,
Mhm.
I think the line is like, she wears a dress of pink and purple roses, and it was so la di da and so tra la la. And like
Mhm.
that shit just cracks me up. And I feel like that's so much of it. Like she's acknowledging the feminine gaze while also like making fun of it. And I think
Yeah.
that's funny. So yeah, like that was like that's the thing, is like so much of it is meant to be over the top and meant to be laughed at. So I'm glad that bit got you.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, it's interesting. I just rewatched Barbie because it came out on digital,
Nice. Cool.
and it's interesting. I feel like they're kind of similar in a way. I mean, they're not like, they're totally different stories, but like the themes, and I feel like you were talking about Jacques Demy, and I haven't seen a Jacques Demy film, but from what I know of him, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I feel like Barbie might have been influenced a little bit visually by Jacques Demy,
Hmm.
and I feel like they both have similar vibes in terms of the themes and some of the visuals.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's very bright. It's very colorful. And Anna Beller does a lot with color theory in her films too. Like you see, in The Love Witch, she's like almost always wearing red, and like everything she owns, like her car is red, her luggage is red, everything is red. Her nails are red. Like she always has some part of like red on her for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's like because red is the color of love and passion, and so there's definitely like something to the use of color in these things. And I think with Barbie, that like pink and like that, the hyper feminine element of it too, definitely carries over. And part of what I was thinking about with the Jacques Demy film too, with Donkey Skin, is the fact that it's like a kind of a parody of, or not a parody, it's like a satire fairy tale where they take all of these like fantasy elements, like big castles and fairy godmothers and kings and queens. And I mean, kings and queens are real, but like in the fantasy world,
Yeah.
with fairy godmothers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it creates this element. And so as I was thinking about that and watching this film, I was thinking about kind of the idea of a fairy tale being repurposed or deconstructed to make a new point, or to comment on the fact that it is a fairy tale. And I think that that's something that can tie into Barbie as well, because like Barbie is very much about grappling with the fact that that this the fantasy of like femininity and womanhood is not realistic. It's not attainable. It's not real. Like you can't be that in the real world,
Mm-hmm.
and yet you want to be that, or you feel like you should be that. And so it's like this existential crisis of realizing that you can't live in the fantasy. And so I think that something that happens in The Love Witch is similar, because she basically believes that if she's able to utilize this love magic in the right way, she can she'll be the ultimate fantasy. That's even one of the lines that one of the guys is like, who are you? And she says, I'm the love witch, I'm your ultimate fantasy. And so she's basically trying to get into the fantasy from the outside. Like, she talks about how, like, before she left her life to live as a witch in Northern California, she had a husband, and he was very mean to her. We don't really know the full scope of it, but he was definitely like verbally abusive at the very least, with some of the things that we hear him say. And so it's kind of this idea of like her living so much in this oppressive reality where like nothing she does is good enough. She's never perfect enough. And the only way that she is perfect enough is by subscribing and giving in basically to this idea of what a woman should be. And by doing that, she's able to get what she wants, what she feels like she needs, which is acceptance, because she wasn't able to get that just by being herself. She had to kind of become this fantasy. So it's kind of like a deconstruction of it from the outside in, where she's trying to become the fantasy so that she can have the dream life. Whereas Barbie, she's in the fantasy and has the dream life, and the conflict arises when she's forced out of it. And so it's kind of a flip-flopping of things. And so it's interesting because, like, as Elaine in the Love Witch is pushing further and further into the fantasy, she has people who are pushing against her, like her friend, whose name I'm spacing on, and I find that really embarrassing. Oh my goodness. Wow, I can't remember her friend's name. The interior decorator who goes to the tea room with her. Do you remember her name?
I know who you're talking about, but for some reason I don't remember her name exactly.
What is wrong with me? Anyway, so during the tea room scene, actually, this is like very early into the movie. So Elaine arrives, she settles into her house, and she's greeted by a friend of the person that she's renting the room from, who's also the interior decorator from the room, and they become friends. And they go to have tea together. And as they're getting to know each other, Elaine kind of explains, a little bit about her past, and that she's trying to just, all she wants is love. All she wants is this perfect love. And in response, her friend is like, aren't you just giving into the patriarchy? She actually says that. She's like, aren't you just kind of like feeding into this patriarchal concept of how women should be, and don't you want to love a man who would love you for you, and like all of this stuff. And so she's constantly getting pushback from it, but she keeps drilling down on this idea of the fantasy, because it keeps being affirmed for her. Like, over and over again, she meets these men and she does this sexy love magic, and it works for her pretty much until it doesn't, which is the climax of the film. And so it's kind of interesting, where it's like a commentary on recognizing that it's not the right thing to do, but also recognizing that there's like truth in it, like we even see it in our daily life, like there's like this whole feminist movement, the post Me Too movement and everything, but then you still have like, this whole idea of like Lux Life Instagram model, just be pretty to get what you want kind of ideal. And so it's like still something that's very real, even though it's totally at odds with like what we're trying to pursue.
Well, it seems like she's using that like knowingly. Like,
yeah.
it seems like, the person at the beginning, her friend, pushes back against it, saying, aren't you giving into the patriarchy? But the reality is she's using it to her advantage to gain power above, men or whoever it might be. And I feel like, she really like lays that out in like the final act. But yeah.
Yeah, but at the end you see that it's not really like, she doesn't really have any power at all. Like at the end of the day, like her power is in manipulating somebody else to do what she wants them to do. And so everything counts on that person, on that manipulation staying, so like the minute that she's actually faced with like a real physical danger, she can't do anything. Like, she's actually powerless. And so it also confronts the fact that like this power that she thinks she has isn't real because it's feeding into a system that is designed to keep you powerless. So it's like you can have all of the strength that you think you have by, you know, getting what you want from a man, but at the end of the day you're still counting on that man to give you what you want. And so it kind of creates this friction between the two things. And so yeah, it's commenting on the problematic elements of feminine fantasy in the female gaze, but also very much does so for the male gaze and everything too. And we see that through Elaine's story of how she's experienced sexual assault and all of these different traumas from men and stuff, and why basically like how those experiences have pushed her into this place. And I think it's really interesting too because it's something that like I've experienced in my own life and something that I've kind of had to reconcile with myself too. Um, because it's just a very real experience as a woman. You're raised to think that like your main ideal is to find love and get married and have a family and do all of these things. And it's like at a certain point it almost becomes something that you expect to have happen to you, where like so many young women will fantasize about their weddings and plan these things and like, you know, they're, you know, all of these daydreams and stuff. And so when you actually grow up and have to face the truth of like this isn't real, there's not somebody that like this is just a fake, you know, it's just a fantasy. And then you kind of have to grapple with the fact that like I kind of had to like deal with that and be like, okay, so much of my perception of myself was tied into this fantasy that was tied into the patriarchy. And so like undoing all of that undoes a major part of who you are. And then you have to rebuild it all. And so it's just kind of interesting to see like the way that that's expressed in this film too, but kind of in a different way of where she's experienced all of these things that's pushed her into this, rather than starting there and being pulled out of it. So yeah, it's kind of like a reversal of it, but it makes the
Yeah.
same commentary. And yeah, I also feel like it's worth mentioning that this is the second movie we've watched that's ended with a woman stabbing a man in bed. So that's always super fun.
I had to think. I guess the other one's Jan Dielman.
Yeah. It ended with like very similar with just like the knife. But I guess that's a little bit spoilers. But yeah, I got ahead of myself there.
Well,
I
that was
keep
a weird part. I mean, not weird. I understand what they were going for, but just how it was cutting. Like, they would show the painting, and I get that they're showing the painting and that, they're making a thematic connection there. But it would cut back and forth to it like over and over again.
Mm,
And then I thought it was interesting how it would go from that into the idealized version of her, her relationship with him, and them on horses and stuff. And I thought it was interesting how that scene was completely silent. Like there was just some weird kind of sound effects, but there was no music. And
mm,
the last shot is just silence pretty much with some loose kind of sound effects. And
yeah.
um so I don't know. The only problem I guess I would have with that scene is just kind of hitting you over the head with the painting. Even though I like the painting, um, but it was interesting the way they were cutting and the editing in that sequence.
Yeah, the paintings, the paintings are definitely used in kind of a heavy-handed way, which I think ties in a bit to the satire of it. And also the paintings are like one of my favorite gags throughout, where like I think it's so funny in movies when like somebody's an artist and they go to show their art and it's like a finished painting and they're just like adding a final touch, and
Yeah,
she does this like 3 times in the movie where she's painting and it's like a dry brush on something that's clearly already dried and finished, and I think that's so funny. Another notable one I think is like an Evil Dead where she's like sketching and it's like already finished.
yeah.
But I think that kind of stuff is just so hilarious.
Makes me
um,
think of Vertigo, which kind of has a similar vibe. But in Vertigo, there's I forget. I think the character's name is like Midge or something. But it's like a woman who James Stewart is talking to, and she has like a self portrait of herself but like it just cuts to like this like perfectly painted portrait of herself. And
Stuff
yeah,
is
makes me think
hilarious
of that.
to me. It's
Yeah.
just like those little gags through the whole movie that just keep kind of like the buoy of humor alive. Because this movie does get like very dark. I mean, along with like scenes of sexual assault and like reminiscence of verbal abuse, there's also suicide in this film, which is very dark. Um, Among other dark elements, there's it's a very bloody film, surprisingly, for everything that it's trying to do. It's still very bloody. Um, and yeah, I think to kind of like give a little bit more, we tend to do this, which I like our conversations, but we tend to jump to the end a little bit prematurely. So
Yeah.
yeah, through the course of the film, she meets a series of men. First is this guy, Wayne, and she seduces him, and they go up to his cabin, and she entices him into drinking a flask of hallucinogenic herbs mixed with vodka, which is such a power move. And we get that great line where she's like, "Finish it," just
Yeah.
so cold. Yeah, and then basically he kind of has a bad trip. I think is what we're supposed to infer from it, and it causes him to like basically have heart failure. Um, those two things are not directly related. He had a stressful situation brought on by the bad trip that caused him to have heart failure.
Well, I thought
So
it was weird because
basically,
she, whenever he dies, she seems surprised, which I was kind of surprised by because I thought she was planning this. But
no, she wanted to love him. She just wanted to
yeah,
love him.
yeah,
No, and that's something that's so interesting too, because it's such a sharp counter criticism to the female gaze, where she kind of creates this idea of who this guy is, and like, oh, he's a professor and he has this, his cabin, by the way, oh my god, oh my
yeah.
god, so beautiful. Like the shot where she's like sitting in his flannel lighting up a cigarette with the wall of like records behind her, I'm like, put me
Mm.
there, I want that life, like
I
I
did
want.
love the wall of records for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
super cool. But anyway, she creates this kind of fantasy of this guy and expects him to be this certain way, like a man. Um, but it's her wrongful assumption of what a man is and who, like, what makes a man, because she believes that like too much emotion is like not correct, like that there needs to be this absolute polarity. Um, and so when he starts to get like emotional from the drugs, she gets very turned off by that, and she gets kind of upset by it, when he's like crying and like pleading for her to stay with him. And so it kind of creates this counter criticism of women's expectations of men, while also criticizing men's expectations of women. So I think it's like very balanced in that, where like she's never entirely like, she's not saying like, oh, women are perfect and everything that men do is wrong. It's very balanced, where it's like women are just as guilty of creating these unrealistic fantasies as men are. And granted, like, granted, I mean, women are having to live under patriarchy, and it is a very different experience and very different situations, but like the
mm-hmm.
mentality of it, there's a lot of similarities there. And so we kind of start to see like where Elaine is not so perfect, and the darker elements of who she is. And so it does end with her burying him in the
Yeah,
backyard. And I think it's so funny that like she's burying this guy, this like human being and stuff. And like while she's doing it, she's like, I've been so depressed since my cat died. And I'm just like,
yeah. I
it's
thought it
like
was weird.
those,
She said it's not the first time she's buried somebody.
yeah, so there's that
So
part too. And you're like, who else have you buried?
yeah,
Um, I think we're supposed to infer that she also killed Jerry in an equally indirect way and probably buried him, which is why she's on the run from Berkeley.
mm-hmm.
But yes, but just like that kind of like disassociation, you really start to see her character and how much she does not actually value these people aside from what she thinks that they can give him or give her. to where like this guy died and she's like, oh, I'm so sad my cat is dead. Like, oh my
Yeah.
God, this guy really meant nothing to you, did he? Um, and it's just like, yeah, this false idea of like what love is, and that love is just supposed to be this give and take transactional engagement, you know, where it's like I fulfill this fantasy for you and you fulfill this fantasy for me, and that's how this works. And it's not real, and it's so it creates so many problems for individuals and for society. And so I think that that's very sharp. But yeah, she kind of goes on to repeat the cycle with a couple other men, one being the husband of her friend, who she seduces and basically breaks his brain until he snaps and in a fit of alcoholism and isolation takes his own life, which is very tragic.
Well, I guess it's interesting. Like, so you interpret this stuff as being them, you know, he killed himself because, or he committed suicide because, you know, of his own mental issues, or like the other person had, you know, he died of a heart failure. Like, because I think I was interpreting it as they died because of the magic.
Oh,
um,
like a spell, like she wanted to kill them?
well, I thought because they drank the potion, and so I thought like, you know, these are the after effects of the potion.
Mm, well, she says that she's trying to do love magic, and she has like their pictures enshrined, and I think she just doesn't I think she yeah, I don't think she wanted to kill them. I don't think that was the intention. I don't because yeah, I just don't think so. I could see how that would make sense, like collecting hearts in a way, and like you'll only ever love me. So like now at the peak of your love, I'll kill
Mm.
you, and so like your love is mine forever. I can see that spin on it, but I think it was more I think the concept is more that she doesn't understand love, and she is so driven by loneliness and a desire for this love that her approach to it is a dangerous one. I think that's kind of what we're supposed to infer, that it's like a wrongful approach. It's not healthy. And so in forcing that upon somebody, it like does harm to them. I think that's kind of what we're supposed to infer. And
Okay.
like the more she asserts this into places where it doesn't belong, such as the guy, you know, who is already married, it like results in death. And I don't know, like I feel like it could be something so metaphorical, but at the same time I don't know. I feel like it's almost too campy to read into it that far. I genuinely just think that like we're supposed to read it as she did these love spells wrong, like too intensely and with the wrong mentality, so that they ended up backfiring essentially. And rather than like making them love her, they made them love her to death. that's
Yeah.
how I that's how I read it. But
I guess like because I was looking at the movie thematically, like there's obviously,
yeah.
you know, a message or there's metaphors going on, but I was
Mm,
also looking at it from like kind of a campy perspective and like a genre
so
perspective.
silly.
Um, because I just feel like there's like a thriller element or like a horror element, and there's like genre tropes that she's playing with. Um, and so I guess that's why maybe I was thinking more in terms of like, you know, a thriller or like a murder mystery or something like that. But it also reminded me a little bit of there's like musical beats that are like seem
Yeah.
like directly taken from like Psycho, and even like her driving around along the coast feels like Psycho. Like those shots of Janet Leigh driving, and some of the shots of like, you know, Norman Bates like burying bodies. They're kind of
Hmm.
like the shots of her burying bodies, but and then Vertigo kind of has a similar visual vibe. Like there's some Hitchcock going on there, I think. But yeah.
That's a great connection because Vertigo takes place in San Francisco too. So it's like a similar area of California.
Mhm.
Granted, she's north of that, but they still reference it. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think yeah, I felt those movies connected to it. I felt like the Herschel Gordon Lewis thing. I felt like a little bit of Brian De Palma, like,
Hmm.
you know. Um but she combines that with like, and then obviously Jacques Demy and stuff, but she combines that with her own, interesting story and interesting ideas. So
What's
yeah,
Paula, do you think?
sort of just like not necessarily thematically, but just visually, like kind of Carrie a little bit. I was thinking about Carrie, like the cinematography of Carrie.
That's a connection as well. Definitely, I see the Hitchcock thing too.
Yeah.
Um,
I guess
yeah,
maybe that's just bleed over from like, I know like De Palma was very influenced by Hitchcock, so maybe that's kind of crossing over in my mind. But yeah,
yeah, and she's pulling so much from that era too that I could definitely see, her drawing a lot of influence from his films because he's so prominent at that time. Um, yeah, so I definitely see what you mean. Yeah, I think you're right though. Like ultimately she's drawing it all to make her own point, and I think she makes it really well in a lot of different ways. Like I was just even thinking about like what it leads to where, after she has this string of victims basically like you can't just kill three people and like, not
yeah,
have any problems. So eventually, the police officer is onto her, the detective is onto her, and before he starts to piece together what's actually going on, they like have their little romance, and then he even once he starts to pick it up like and understand what's happening, he even tries to defend her, which is interesting. um but ultimately they're kind of forced to like see each other for what they are. Like she sees him as like, being this, I don't know, they're kind of like forced to like view each other's characters outside of the fantasy. Um, and before that though, they do participate in like the peak fantasy where they go to like they like ride on a white horse into this like Renaissance fair and they get fake married and it's so beautiful and there's like the jester playing lute or whatever and it's like this whole like it's so over the top and it's so just camp and it's so silly, but it's like but that's what she wanted, and it's just like it just kind of
mm-hmm.
lampoons this concept of like, is this really what you want, this like whole crazy like delusional idea? And so
Yeah,
she's kind of forced to face this. um and I think it's interesting too that like at the end, they're sitting at the bar together, and I kind of touched on this before of like how she creates this power for herself, but it's not like a real power for herself. Like it's power, but it's power dependent on another person. And I think that's interesting with the way the bar scene shakes out, where she's like, yeah, if this were if this was the past, I could be burned for these things, but I can't now. And then in the blink of an eye, there's a mob and it's like taking her and she's screaming and they're like, burn the witch. And it's just like this whole kind of thing of like, as much as we think things have changed, they haven't really. And that's a commentary on like the, I guess, religion of with oh my goodness. Whoa. I guess it's like a commentary on like the religion, but it's also commentary on like gender roles. Like as much as we think that we've come so far, like in the heat of the moment, it's we still tend to fall back into these same things. And so it's like, oh, I'm not, if this were another era, these things could be expected of me, but not anymore. But then actually, it's still very real and it's still such a problem.
mm-hmm.
And so I just think that like at so many different points through the film, she takes the opportunity to like say more and in a different way. And I thought that was really well done too. And that scene was also really scary because it's like their first reaction is like to strip her and like try to attack her and like sexually assault her. And like I think they even cut to like a couple of guys like starting to unbutton their pants. And it's just like, yeah, it's this idea of that like for all of her feminine power and for all of the sexual power that she gained for herself, like it's kind of her undoing at the same time at the end. So
Mm-hmm.
then it's like, what really, is feminine power? What really should we be seeking? And I guess like the idea is like equality. Well, that is the idea. That's the point, is equality. is that the expectation should never be that, these things would happen to somebody. Yeah, I've been going on a lot of tangents. I'm sorry.
Oh no problem. That part reminded me in the bar. Reminded me a little bit of Perfect Blue. The seeing the strip club in Perfect Blue. But
Yeah.
For some reason I was thinking about that. Yeah.
I was actually just talking about this last night with Diggy
Mm-hmm.
on our Discord, and we were talking about the way that Satoshi Kon had approached depicting sexual assault, and the fact that like it is very possible for men to create these scenes and situations and comment on these things in a way that's sensitive and understanding. And I think that that's a very good comparison, because he did it in a way that was like very much aware of the like trauma and violence involved in these things without actually like showing anything or pushing it too far. And so yeah, I think that's a good point to make too. And yeah, in this one it's kind of the same thing, where like there are all of these implications of things that happen to her, and we know things have happened to her. And in that bar scene she does get away, but like in the past we see these things happen. Like even when she's initiated into becoming a witch, we see her, I don't. It's almost a gray area. Like my feeling is that it is essay, because like she's clearly not interested and she doesn't want it to be happening. Like when she's on the altar, she's clearly uncomfortable and doesn't want to be there. But she also feels like she has to in order to be initiated into this like coven or group. So yeah, just the different ways that Anna Biller approaches explaining that this person has experienced sexual assault multiple times in their life without ever actually showing it, I think is something that people could take notes on. And she does that with other things too. Like I've mentioned, like the experiences that she had with her husband Jerry before he died. And the way that he like basically like undermined her confidence and was like emotionally and like verbally abusive and stuff, of like, you've gained too much weight, you're not doing enough, all this stuff. And and granted that was like softball stuff, but like you can see she's basically like implying this darker thing without actually pushing there, in the same way that she does with the other depictions of abuse. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to see a female director comment on these things in such a sharp and acute way while still being very sensitive about them. Yeah, she does it so well.
Yeah.
I mean, sure. I just feel like I keep getting lost in my trains of thought, but yeah, so it's an interesting film and it's worth checking out, because it does do so much, and I feel like there's a lot that can be gained from viewing it from the perspective of like hearing this woman's voice in the way that she perceives things, and it does make a larger commentary on women's experiences, and so I think it's very worth checking out for that. It's beautiful film. It's a beautiful film aesthetically. It's very funny. But I will also say, like, I recognize that this isn't a film for everybody because it is so stylized. Like, I could see a lot of people being turned off by the humor. Even the line delivery is like part of the bit where like their delivery is so, it's so like robotic sometimes. It's so funny, where she'll be like, "Oh, you do interior design." "Yes, I do." And it's just like,
well, I think it's going for like kind of a, like I said before, like a Herschel Gordon Lewis, like very campy B movie. Like bad acting, but not that, like, I'm not saying they're actually bad acting, but like it's sort of the style of that.
Yeah, so it's like I could definitely see how, like, it wouldn't land well with everybody, but I think that anybody who has I guess we've spoiled a lot of this now, but anybody who's thought about watching it should explore more of her stuff, because I think she has a lot to say, and I think she says it well. And it was fun rewatching this and reaffirming it as a movie that I love, because it had been a little while, and I feel like my perspective has grown a little bit over the last year. So a little part of me was worried that it was going to be maybe not as strong as I remembered it, but it is. And I hope more people watch it. And it's one that I could definitely see being looked back at as a cult classic. Like I could see this becoming that with more virility than it has now, because I think it's already like a little bit considered that, but because it's still relatively new, it hasn't quite reached that status. But I could see like 10, 20 years from now people being like, you should really watch The Love Witch.
Yeah.
But also hopefully our gender politics will have evolved more over that time, and maybe we won't need movies like this in the same way.
Yeah, that's true. I wonder if it was shot on film. I would think, well, I don't know. Because
I'm not
sometimes it
sure.
gives the vibe of film, but there were certain times where like it almost kind of had like a digitally feel to me.
Hmm.
But the only reason I mentioned that is because I was gonna say like I think it'd be great if they released it on like Vinegar Syndrome or something like that, like a 4K release. But but yeah, I mean, I'm glad I watched it. I've been wanting to watch it for a long time. So yeah.
Yeah, I know Oscilloscope put it out. I don't know if they have a 4K, but I know that they had a Blu-ray release. And I'd love to pick that up because I'd love to listen to the commentary and just kind of like see a little bit more about how it was made. And just, you know, hear more from her. And I hope she does more stuff. I know she does like she's put on a couple like stage plays too, so maybe that's just more of what she's interested in doing. And maybe this was the side project from that stuff.
Yeah.
Either way, I'm
Well,
glad she did it.
I was surprised looking at her filmography that like some of her shorts go like really far back, like into the 90s.
Yeah.
So she's been doing it for a while, it seems like.
Yeah, she definitely has stuck to this aesthetic too, which is very admirable. Like it's very, you can sense that it's very true to her, and I like that. But yeah, she's an OG goat. Been doing it since the '90s. We love to see it. Um, yeah, and it's like she has such a fresh perspective too, and it's just so great. Um, I don't know. I feel like I could talk about this movie for a long time, but I also feel like I've talked a lot already. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's really worth touching on or digging into. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff with yeah, just with like the way that she stages different things and like the environments and like the different like even just like Elaine's apartment I think is really interesting and cool. Um, yeah, there's just I don't know. I feel like I lost my train of thought. But yeah, it's worth checking out. It's one I love. I recommend it to those who are interested in hyper stylized satires. I think you'll find something to enjoy. Um, or if you just want to hear a little bit more from women and our perspective and
Mhm.
what life is like, what life is like in the fantasy and outside of it. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I think it's interesting, and yeah, I'm always very curious to see where this kind of stylized filmmaking from women goes in the future. I mean, you mentioned Barbie, and I feel like that does kind of tie into this vein a little bit too. Um, yeah, I kind of hope that it continues because I think that it's very poignant and has a lot to offer. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
Is there anything else you wanted to touch on? I feel like I'm forgetting stuff, but I feel like I've talked a lot.
Oh no, yeah, I think that's pretty much it for me. I give it a 4 out of 5. That'd be my
That's
rating.
strong. I'm
Hmm.
so glad you liked it. I was honestly not sure if it would land with you. So I'm glad that you enjoyed it, and I'm so
Mm.
glad you decided to give it a try,
Yeah.
and reached out to me to talk about it. I think that's so great. Yeah, I appreciate that from you.
Oh, no problem.
I'll give it a 5. I've given it a 5 before, so it's nothing new. And it's funny because when I first saw this, I actually gave it a 4, and the second time I saw it, I gave it a 4. But then the more recent times that I've watched it, I bumped it up to a 5. So yeah, I'm right there with you. I get it. But yeah, I hope you do check out more of her stuff. Check out Donkey Skin from Jack Demi. Um, I'll check out some Herschel Gordon Lewis
Hmm.
films, and we'll chit chat more.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, thanks for being here, and
Of course.
yeah, thank you. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. But yeah, thanks for everybody for watching,
Mhm.
and I'll see you later. Bye.
Bye.